A thin October sky hangs over the empty hill. Wind moves through brown grass kept short around two graves side by side. A woman's hand reaches down, clears the season's dust from letters cut deep by careful hands, then stops. Something cold waits half buried at the foot of the marker. She draws it free, an old canteen smaller than any a rider would carry. The stopper is long gone. Around its mouth a pale chalky crust clings greenish at the edges. Not rust. Nothing ordinary weather ever left behind. Her pulse climbs hard against her ribs. At the base of the hill a dark figure stands motionless, watching. Beyond the barn a newly driven iron stake rises from the ground, red cloth tied at its crown and stirring like a wound no one has closed. She closes her fingers around the metal, takes the first step down the slope. The wind does not stop. Neither does the watching. The letter weighed nothing. 9 words. A scrap of paper folded twice and pressed into her glove like a coin pressed into a beggar's palm. Tell Corrigan I am sorry. Ask him to wait. Josephine Whitlock read it again anyway. 3rd time since the stage left Cedar Hollow. 4th, maybe. She had lost count somewhere around the 2nd dry wash, when the wheels dropped into a rut and threw her shoulder into the window frame, and she had to catch the paper before it slid off her knee. Her father's handwriting. Small, cramped. The letters of a man who used to write big, bold, sure of himself, not anymore. She folded it back along its old creases, slid it into her glove, looked out the window instead, because looking at the letter too long made her want to cry, and she was not going to cry. Not on a public stage. Not in front of a drummer who slept with his hat over his eyes and a rancher's wife who had already decided, one glance in, exactly what kind of woman wore a darned cuff and a borrowed shawl. The mesquite went by in gray-green ranks. Endless, the kind of tree that didn't care whether you were coming or going. She was going. 40 miles from her father's freight yard to a rancher's front door, to say sorry for a debt she hadn't made, to a man she had never met. That was the whole of it. That was her errand. Her mother used to say a debt was just a promise wearing its Sunday clothes. Eleanor Whitlock had died 11 years back, of nothing more dramatic than a hard winter and a weak chest, and Josephine still caught herself thinking in her mother's sayings at odd moments, usually the moments that called for more courage than she actually had on hand. A promise wearing its Sunday clothes. Well, this one had gone threadbare a long time ago, and she was the one who had to walk it up to a stranger's door and hope he didn't notice the seams. The aspens up on the ridgeline had already turned, gold against a sky gone thin and pale the way October sky goes when it knows winter's coming and isn't going to pretend otherwise. She had grown up under that light. Left it 9 years back, a bride with a satchel and a head full of promises nobody kept. Came home to it a widow. Same satchel. Fewer promises. Her husband had been a good man. Careful with horses, careless with rivers. The crossing at Willow Creek had taken him under 2 summers ago, the current higher than anybody judged, the cattle spooking, and that was the whole story people told about it now. Quick, clean, over in one sentence the way tragedy gets folded down small enough to fit in polite conversation. Josephine did not fold it down, she just didn't talk about it. She remembered instead, sometimes, the small useless things. The particular way he'd whistled off key while he saddled a horse. The way he'd once carried a whole basket of eggs 11 miles rather than admit he'd forgotten to buy flour and had to trade for it. She had loved him plainly without ceremony, the way you love a thing that's simply always been kind to you. And then the river had taken him, and she had gone back to her father's house a widow at 26 with nothing to her name but a satchel and a grief nobody in Cedar Hollow much wanted to hear about twice. The rancher's wife across the aisle looked at her once more. At the plain gray dress. At the hands work Ruth in folded twos. Still inept, then looked away. The way you look away from a stove you already know is cold. Josephine was used to that look. A woman with nothing learns the shape of a room fast. Learns where the eyes go. They didn't go to her. Hadn't in years. She'd stopped waiting on it. The stage put her down at a gate in the middle of the afternoon, and the first thing she thought, the very first thing was, I didn't know it would be this far in. Because the road just kept going. Past a windmill turning slow and lazy against a sky doing nothing. Past cattle pens. Past a bunkhouse long enough to sleep half a county. Past a barn, the size of a church, the kind of barn a man builds when he has stopped worrying about money and started worrying about other things. And beyond the barn, a hill. Brown grass, combed flat by wind. One dark shape at the crown of it she couldn't make out from this distance. She didn't know yet what that shape was. She would. The house sat square in the middle of all of it. Didn't announce itself. Didn't need to. It just stood there, sure of its own weight. The way money stands when it's been rooted in one place long enough to stop trying to impress anybody. Josephine smoothed her skirt with both hands twice. Because once didn't feel like enough and 3 times felt nerves. And she was not going to walk up to that door showing nerves. Say the words plain, she told herself. Say them and go home. Except she had told herself that same thing on the stage, twice, and it hadn't kept her hands from shaking either time. She walked up to the door. She knocked. The woman who opened it was somewhere past 50, broad through the shoulder, flour dusted up to the wrist, and she took Josephine's measure in one single unhurried pass head to hem to eyes. If you're selling, the woman said, we've got it already. I'm not selling, then what? I've come to see Mr. Corrigan. He's at the branding pen. Everybody's at the branding pen. A pause, a longer look. What's your business, girl? Josephine kept the letter in her glove, didn't offer it, not yet. Not to a stranger at a door. It's a private word. From my father. And who's your father that he sends a girl and no name of his own? Silas Whitlock, of the Cedar Hollow Freight Yard. Something crossed the older woman's face, not scorn, not quite, but the particular caution of someone who's been waiting for this exact knock a while and isn't glad, now that it's finally come. She stepped back, held the door wider. Come in out of the light. Then, already turning, I'm Connie Abernathy. I keep this house from falling in on itself, and don't let anybody tell you different. You'll wait in the kitchen, not the parlor. The parlor's for people who don't work, and I've never met one worth the good chairs. She said it dry. No heat in it at all. Sit, Connie added over her shoulder. You look like a hard ride. The kitchen was the biggest room Josephine had ever stood in, arranged like a locomotive, a table long enough to seat a crew, bread cooling under cloth. The whole room smelled like flour and wood smoke and something simmering low that she couldn't name and desperately wanted to. She sat on the edge of a bench, folded her hands, waited. Connie cut bread without being asked, set a slice in front of her, scraped with butter, and said, not looking up, I knew the name when you gave it. Josephine's stomach dropped an inch. You know my father. Everybody in this valley knows that name this month. Connie set the knife down. I know what he owes. Do you? It was not a question. Eat. Talk after. A glance toward the window where the light was already starting to lean golden long. Corrigan won't be in till the light goes. Sorry keeps better on a full stomach than an empty one. So Josephine ate. Because she was hungry, and because kindness offered plain is a hard thing to refuse, and because arguing with Connie Abernathy already felt like arguing with weather. A young man came through the kitchen partway through the meal, tall and broad-shouldered and clearly in a hurry, hauling a coil of rope over one arm. He nodded to Connie, gave Josephine a curious glance that stopped just short of rude, and grabbed a heel of bread off the counter without breaking stride. That's Pruitt, Connie said, once the door had swung shut behind him. Foreman. Good man. Talks about as much as a fence post, but he'll ride into a fire for this outfit if you ask him to, and you won't even have to ask twice. You seem to think highly of everyone here. I think highly of the ones who've earned it. Connie's dry eyes flicked to her, considering. I'll tell you the same thing I've told every soul who's ever sat on that bench, girl. I don't waste kindness on people who won't use it right. So far you're eating my bread without arguing about whether you deserve it. That's a fair start. Out the window, past the barn, the hill stood with its single dark shape against a sky going the color of a bruise, and Josephine's eyes kept drifting back to it. Kept catching there. That's the marker, Connie said without turning from the range. You'll not ask about it, and I'll not tell you. That's his. I wasn't going to ask. No, Connie looked at her now, a long study. I don't believe you were. That's a point in your favor, girl. You'd be surprised how few have it. Garrett Corrigan came in with the last of the light. Josephine heard him before she saw him. The scrape of spurs left at the door. A low word to a dog somewhere in the yard. The particular heavy quiet of a man who has worked since before dawn and has nothing left in him for small talk. Then he filled the doorway. Tall. Ash-brown hair gone dusty at the temples with the day's dirt. A week of the gather written into the set of his shoulders. And his eyes, amber held up to lamplight, went to her at once, and did not slide off. That was the first thing Josephine noticed. Most people's eyes slid off her inside of 2 seconds. His didn't. He looked at her the way a man looks at a column of figures he intends to read clean down to the bottom. Connie says you've come from Whitlock. No greeting, not unkind. Just a too tired for the long way round. Josephine stood. Took the letter from her glove. Held it out. Her voice came steadier than she'd rehearsed it, which surprised her, because she'd rehearsed it the entire 40 miles. My father asked me to bring you this, and to say he's sorry, and to ask if you'd wait on the debt a while longer. Garrett didn't take the paper. He looked at it in her hand. Looked at her. How much did he tell you it was? He didn't tell me the sum, $1,100. Flat. The way a man names a distance on a map, nothing more. I fronted him against a freight contract that never came through. Let him carry it 2 winters running. A beat. It's not the money that's the trouble, Mrs. Whitlock. Still Whitlock. Mrs. Whitlock. He took off his hat, held it, turned it once in his hands. The money I can lose. Men lose money. It's that your father sent his daughter to say a sorry he wouldn't ride out and say himself. That's the part I can't quite make my peace with. The words landed exactly where he'd aimed them. Josephine felt the color come up her throat. But she had crossed 40 miles of dry wash to get to this kitchen, and she was not going to flinch at the truth simply because it happened to be hers. He's ashamed, she said. A proud man who can't pay grows a coward about it fast. I don't excuse him for it. I only came because someone had to, and there was no one but me. The kitchen went very quiet. Connie had gone still by the range, a spoon forgotten in her hand. Garrett turned the hat once more. No one but you, he repeated. Slow, like he was tasting the shape of it. You've no husband to send instead? He drowned. 2 years back, a river crossing. And your father houses you now. My father lets me keep his house, cook his supper, and answer for his debts. Something came out sharper than she meant. Houses is a large word for it. She hadn't meant to say that much. It came out of her plainer than she liked, and she watched it strike him. Watched a small, careful recalculation happen behind his eyes. Like a card he'd expected blank had turned up with writing on it after all. Sit down, Mrs. Whitlock, Garrett said. You'll not ride back tonight. Connie will make up a bed. In the morning we'll talk about your father's debt like grown people. He hung his hat on the peg by the door. Connie, is there supper, or did the crew eat the house down to the walls again? There's supper for anyone civil enough to ask. But Connie's dry eyes had found Josephine's across the kitchen, and there was something in them that was almost a warning, or almost a welcome, or the narrow country between the two. That night Josephine sat on the edge of a bed that wasn't hers, still in her traveling dress, listening to a house she didn't belong to breathe around her. She had come to say sorry and ask for time. She would say it. She would go home. That would be the end of the Whitlocks and the Corrigans and the $1,100. She told herself that 3 times. She was wrong on every count. She just didn't know it yet. The morning found her before anyone else did, because Josephine had risen at first gray, out of 9 years of habit, and come down to a kitchen where nobody had lit the range, so she lit it herself. Had the fire drawing and the coffee started before she heard boots on the stair behind her. Garrett Corrigan came down into his own kitchen and stopped in the doorway. He watched her a moment. A stranger standing at his stove like she'd stood there her whole life. Easy. Certain. Like the room already knew her. He didn't say anything about it. They ate. Connie, Garrett, Josephine, the quiet passed between them, the kind that isn't uncomfortable so much as waiting. And when the plates were cleared, Garrett sent Connie out to check the smokehouse, which Josephine understood. Even then, was not about the smokehouse at all. He sat across from her with his coffee, and he said the thing he'd apparently lain awake half the night deciding how to say. I have a proposal for you, Mrs. Whitlock. Josephine set down her cup. Careful. That's a large word to open with, not the kind it usually means. He met her eyes. Hear the whole of it before you answer me anything. I'm listening. Your father owes me $1,100. He'll never pay it. I've no stomach for putting an old man out on the road, whatever the county thinks I ought to do about it. He turned the cup slowly on the table, not drinking from it. But there's a thing I need worse than money just now, and it's a wife. Josephine said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that saying nothing is the surest way to hear the rest of a thing. Not for the reason you're bracing for, Garrett said, and there was a dry flicker of something in it. Gone quick. My father's will reads that this ranch passes whole to me on my 35th birthday, 6 weeks from now. Unmarried, it splits. Half to me, half to my cousin Wendell, and Wendell wants it split. Wendell has wanted a great many things for a great many years. This is only the one he's close enough to reach. He said it plain. No heat, which somehow made it land harder than heat would have. So you need a wife, Josephine said slowly, by a date on a calendar. I need a wife I can trust not to be angling for the grass under my house. I've had 6 weeks of mothers marching daughters through my kitchen like it's a cattle show, and I am plagued, Mrs. Whitlock. I cannot ride to town without a pie following me home. You could simply refuse the pies. I've tried. Turns out a man can't out-stubborn an entire county of matchmaking mothers. I've a better chance arguing with the weather. Another flicker gone as fast as it came, close enough to a real smile that Josephine noticed it and filed the noticing away. I watched you light a stove that isn't yours this morning like you owned the deed to it. I know enough. You don't know me, I know enough to start. He set the cup down, met her eyes square, the way he had the night before, the way that didn't slide off. Marry me, Mrs. Whitlock. The debt's forgiven the day you do. Your father keeps his yard clear. You keep this house in my name, which in this valley is worth considerably more than it ought to be. And I keep my ranch whole, and every matchmaking mother in the county off my porch. Mutual convenience, both of us walk out of a trap neither one of us set. It was, Josephine thought, the strangest thing anyone had ever said to her. And the strangest part of it was this: he had not once, in the whole of it, offered her pity. He hadn't said, poor woman. Hadn't said, let me save you. He'd laid it out flat, like a trade between equals, like she had something he wanted. Like she was not a burden to be carried but a bargain to be struck. She had not been offered a fair trade in a very long time. And if I say no, she said, what becomes of my father's debt then? Then it's forgiven anyway. I'll not hold a man's daughter hostage to collect on $1,100. I'm asking you a separate question, Mrs. Whitlock. Don't confuse the two. That, more than anything else he'd said, was what nearly undid her composure entirely, because it meant he'd already decided to forgive the debt before he ever opened his mouth about a wife. The proposal wasn't the price of her father's freedom. It was only plainly exactly what he'd said. It was a separate question, asked honestly, with no strings hidden underneath it. You don't know me, she said again, quieter this time. No, Garrett agreed, I don't. She did not answer him that first day, nor the second. Garrett rode out before light to the branding pen and came back after dark, and in between he left her be, the way a man leaves a fire be, once he's laid the wood and struck the match. Let it catch on its own time. Don't crowd it. Josephine had not intended to be useful. She had intended to sit quiet in the good bedroom and turn the whole thing over in her mind like a coin, heads then tails, then heads again. Except a woman who has run a household of nothing on nothing for 9 straight years cannot watch a big kitchen limping along at half senses and keep her hands still. It isn't in her. It was never in her. By the second evening she'd found 40 pounds of good beans going to weevil for want of turning. Found the hams hung too close to the range, sweating in their own fat. Moved them without being asked. You needn't, Connie said, watching her skim a stockpot with the calm authority of a woman who had cooked for this house alone for years and did not, on principle, trust help. I know I needn't, Josephine said. Give me the long spoon. Connie gave her the long spoon. After that, they worked well together. The wordless way of two women who both know a kitchen down to its bones. And there was a man on the place, too. Josephine had noticed him the second afternoon, coming and going from the small office off the barn, a lean, watchful figure, Garrett's age or near it, with a smile that arrived a half-beat too fast, and eyes that didn't stay on any one thing very long. That's Wendell, Connie said, following her look out the window. Her voice had gone flat in a way it hadn't for anyone else. Mr. Corrigan's cousin handles the books when he's asked to, and sometimes when he isn't. He seems... Josephine searched for the word. He seems like a man who smiles because it costs him nothing, Connie said. You'll form your own opinion, I expect. Most do. He came to find her himself that same afternoon while she was sorting linens in the hall off the kitchen and leaned in the doorway with an ease that struck her, even then, as slightly rehearsed. Mrs. Whitlock, or forgive me, I hear congratulations may soon be in order. Nothing's decided, Mr. Corrigan. Wendell, please, we're practically family already, aren't we? His smile arrived right on schedule. I only wanted to say I think it's a fine notion. Garrett's been alone too long up here. It isn't good for a man, all that quiet. That's kind of you, I mean every word of it. He glanced past her, toward the small office at the end of the hall, where a ledger sat open on the desk. You'll find the books in decent order, if you ever have cause to look at them. I keep them honest. It was such an odd thing to say unprompted, unasked, that Josephine only nodded, and said nothing, and watched him go with the particular unease of a woman who has just heard someone deny a thing nobody accused him of. She found her footing among the hands, too, in those first days, in the small, unremarkable ways that mattered more than she'd expected them to. A grizzled older man named Tuck, who'd worked the outfit longer than Garrett had been alive, took to leaving a brace of quail on the kitchen step some mornings, saying nothing about it, expecting nothing in return, until Josephine started leaving a wrapped biscuit on the same step in trade, and the two of them settled into a wordless arrangement that suited them both fine. A younger hand, barely more than a boy, blushed scarlet the first time she asked his name directly, and could barely stammer out Charlie, ma'am, before finding urgent business elsewhere. She liked them for it. Liked the plainness of it, the lack of anything performed or calculated. It was a different kind of attention than she'd grown used to receiving, and she found she didn't mind it half as much as she'd expected to. She did look at the ledger 3 days later, when Connie sent her to fetch a receipt for the mercantile. Nothing leapt out at her rows of figures. Feed costs, all of it neat enough. Except one line, dated the spring before last, marked simply Water Rights North section, with a sum beside it that seemed, to her admittedly untrained eye, larger than the entry above or below it had any obvious reason to be. She read it twice, found no explanation attached, closed the ledger and told herself it was nothing a woman new to a house, looking for shadows in perfectly ordinary sunlight. She filed it away all the same, next to the too fast smile, next to the eyes that never stayed anywhere long enough to be honest. On the third morning, Garrett did not ride out with the crew. Moving's done, he said over coffee. 2 days of branding left, but Pruitt can start it without me. A pause, careful. I said I'd take you up the hill. A man ought to keep his word to a woman he's asked to marry, even before she said yes. They walked up through brown autumn grass behind the barn, and the morning was cool and clean, the kind of morning that makes you believe, for a little while, that nothing bad has ever happened anywhere. Except it had. Up here it had. At the crest, the grass had been kept scythe short, 2 graves side by side, under a single marker a slab of oak gone silver with weather, letters cut deep by a hand that had taken its time and hadn't cared how long it took. Thomas Corrigan, his wife Louise taken by the fever the same week, my brother, Garrett said. He stood with his hat in his hands, the same way he'd stood in the kitchen the first night. Ran this outfit with me. Ran it better than I do, if I'm honest about it. Had the gift for it. Reading grass. Reading weather. Reading men. He looked at the second, smaller length of grave, and something rough came into his voice. There was a night, the summer before, when a storm took half our herd toward the river, and Thomas rode out alone in the dark to turn them, because he said I'd only just married the notion of ranching, and he'd been born into it, and born men ought to take the worst risk. He came back at dawn soaked through and laughing about it, like it was nothing. That's the brother I had, Mrs. Whitlock, the kind who laughed about the nights that should have killed him. He drew a breath. Fever came up the valley 2 autumns back. Took them both inside 8 days. A pause. Left me the grass, the house, more money than one man's got a use for, and left me nothing else. No one else. Josephine stood beside him and did not fill the quiet with easy words. She had buried a husband. She knew the worst thing you could do at a graveside was talk just to hear yourself talking. I carved the marker myself, Garrett said. Took a month of evenings. I'm no hand with letters. But I couldn't put a store-bought board over my own brother. Some things a man's got to cut with his own hands or they don't count. They count, Josephine said quietly. I can see that from here. He looked at her then, and for one moment, the careful man was not careful at all. That's the whole of the house, Mrs. Whitlock. That's what's on this hill. A brother I loved, and a grief I don't know how to set down. If you marry me, you marry that too. I'll not pretend the ground up here is only mine to carry. The wind moved the grass. Down below, the windmill turned, slow, patient, indifferent to everything happening above it. Josephine looked at the marker, at the deep, careful letters, at the scythed grass. A busy, grieving man had somehow found the hours to keep clean, week after week alone, with nobody watching. A man's true measure is in the things he tends when no one's there to see it. Yes, she said. Garrett turned his head. Yes to which part? Yes to the marriage. Yes to the grief. Yes to the hill. She drew her shawl closer against the wind. I came here with nothing but a sorry that wasn't mine. You've offered me a fair trade and no pity, and that's more than any soul has offered me in 2 years. I'll not be fooled enough to turn it down because it isn't a love story. That's a hard thing to say on a hilltop. It's a true thing. You're a plain man, Mr. Corrigan. I thought you'd rather the truth. Something close to real humor rose behind his eyes for the first time since she'd known him. I would, he said. God help me. I believe I would. They were married 11 days later on a Thursday in the front room of the Redstone Crossing Church. It was a small building, whitewashed, with a bell that had cracked years back and rang now with a flat, honest note nobody had ever bothered to fix, and Josephine found she liked it better for the imperfection. Connie stood witness in her good dark dress, sniffing once at the vows and denying it fiercely afterward to anyone who dared mention it. Pruitt stood witness too, a broad, quiet man who kept twisting his hat like it had done him some personal wrong, and who shook Garrett's hand afterward with a grip that seemed to say more than he had words for. Wendell did not attend. Garrett didn't mention it, and Josephine noted that he didn't mention it, and filed the noticing away someplace quiet, to look at later. Silas Whitlock stood at the back in his one good coat, unable to meet his daughter's eye through the whole ceremony. There were no flowers. Josephine wore her gray dress, cleaned and pressed, the best she owned. The preacher read the simple words. Garrett said, his part low and steady. Josephine said hers the same. When it was done, he didn't kiss her. They hadn't spoken of that, and he was too careful a man to presume. But he took her hand a moment, both of his around it, rough and warm, and said, "You've got a home now, Mrs. Corrigan. Whatever else this is or isn't, you've got that." Josephine, who had not had a home to call her since she was a girl, found she could not answer him at all. Her father caught her at the door as they left. Silas Whitlock was a gray man now, stooped where he'd once stood straight, his hands never quite still, the way a man's hands go after they've spent too long twisting a hat that isn't there anymore. "I never meant for it to come to this," he said, "marrying you off to clear my slate. You didn't marry me off, Papa." She kept her voice low for his dignity, not hers. "I married myself. There's a difference, I'd have you remember it. He's a good man. He's a fair one. That's rarer." She looked at her father, at the ruin the debt had made of him, and found she had no anger left to spend on it. Only a tired kind of love, the kind that survives disappointment by simply outlasting it. "Keep your yard, Papa. Keep your head up in this town. That's all I ask of the whole business." He nodded, looked away, could not say the thing he wanted to say, so Josephine said it for him, one hand on his sleeve, before she turned to go. "It's all right," she told him. "It's turned out all right." Whether she believed that or only wished it, she could not have said. But her father's shoulders came up half an inch when she said it, the way a man's shoulders do when he's let off a weight he can no longer carry alone, and that half inch was worth the lie if it was one. Marriage to a stranger is a country you learn one road at a time. Josephine learned Ironwood the way she'd learned everything hard in her life, by rising early and watching close. She learned Garrett took his coffee black and his troubles quiet. Learned he slept in the small room off the office, that he'd made up the big bedroom for her without a word, that the whole delicate business of separate rooms had settled itself before it ever had the chance to be awkward. She never had to ask. He never had to offer. She learned that Connie ran the house like a small, well-defended kingdom, and that earning her trust was a longer road than earning Garrett's had been. And she learned, in smaller and colder increments, the shape of Wendell Corrigan. He was polite to her, almost too polite. He complimented her cooking the third day, called her a fine addition to the family the fifth, and both times something in his eyes didn't match the words coming out of his mouth. Like a man reading lines off a card he'd written himself, and wasn't entirely sure he believed. "He's asked me twice this week." When the wedding was decided on, Connie mentioned one evening, not looking up from the bread she was kneading, exact date, down to the hour. Why would that matter to him? I couldn't say. Connie's hands kept working the dough, steady, unhurried. But a man who counts another man's wedding hour like it's a debt coming due, that's a man keeping a ledger somewhere you can't see it. Josephine turned that over a long while after the kitchen went dark that night. Thought of the water rights entry she'd found. Didn't reach the bottom of either mystery. Filed them away instead, next to Wendell's absence from the wedding, next to the too-fast smile, next to the eyes that never stayed anywhere long enough to be honest. She learned something of Connie's own history, too, in a rare unguarded hour one evening when the two of them sat shelling peas on the back step, and the older woman, for reasons Josephine never quite determined, decided the moment had come to speak of it. "I had a husband once," Connie said, not looking up from her work, "long before I ever came to this outfit. A good man, if a foolish one. Died owing money to men who didn't much care for waiting on it. I know something of what it is to ride into a stranger's house, carrying a debt that isn't rightly yours to carry, Mrs. Whitlock, if you'll permit me saying so." Josephine set down the pea pod in her hand. "I didn't know. No reason you should have. I don't offer it up often." Connie's hands kept working, steady as ever, though something in her voice had gone softer than Josephine had yet heard it. "Old Mr. Corrigan, Garrett's father, took me on when nobody else in 3 counties would hire a widow with debts of her own still hanging over her. Never once asked me to feel grateful for it, either. which I've always thought was the finest kindness a proud woman can be given. Just work, he told me. Do the work well and the rest takes care of itself. Is that why you keep this house the way you do? Like it's yours to defend? It is mine to defend, Connie said. Simple as anything. Place takes you in when you've got nowhere else to stand. You don't forget that. Not ever. You spend the rest of your days making sure nobody tears it down around the people who let you stay. She glanced over, finally, something almost gentle in the look. I'd say the same's becoming true of you, girl, whether you've noticed it yet or not. Josephine hadn't noticed, or hadn't let herself notice, which she was coming to understand, might be a different thing entirely. She thought of it often in the weeks after the particular way a house could take a person who had nothing and hand them back to themselves whole. These were the increments the first 2 weeks were made of. A pantry set right, a smokehouse reorganized, a man's coffee learned exactly the way he took it, without him having to say so twice. None of it was love, or Josephine didn't call it that. It was only two people learning to be useful to each other, which was a plainer thing. She was coming to think it a sturdier one, too. There was an evening, near the end of that second week, when Garrett found her sitting alone on the porch, step after the supper dishes were done, watching the last light go purple over the western ridge, and instead of passing on through to the barn, the way he usually did, he sat down beside her. You go quiet some evenings, he said. Not a question, just an observation offered plain the way he offered everything. I was thinking of my first husband. She hadn't meant to say it so directly. It came out anyway. He used to sit just like this. Same hour. Said the light did something to a man's thinking he couldn't get any other way. What was his name? Daniel. She turned the word over, surprised at how strange it felt in her own mouth after so long. I don't say it often. Nobody in Cedar Hollow much wanted to hear it, once the mourning year was through. Grief makes people uneasy past a certain point. They start to feel they've done their duty by it and would rather you moved along. I'll not tell you to move along. Garrett looked out at the ridge, not at her, which she was coming to understand was his particular kindness, his person purposed to speak, without the weight of being watched while they did it. You can say his name here whenever it suits you. I'd rather know the whole of who I married than only the parts that are convenient. Josephine felt something loosen in her chest that had been pulled tight for 2 years running. He whistled off key, she said, and heard her own voice catch, just slightly, on the small foolish memory of it. Every single time he saddled a horse. Never once got the tune right. I used to tease him over it. Sounds like a man worth missing. He was. She looked at her hands. I don't think that's a betrayal of you, saying so. I hope you don't take it as one. I'd think less of you if you didn't miss him, Garrett said. A woman who could bury a husband and feel nothing left over isn't a woman I'd have wanted to marry in the first place. He was quiet a moment. I miss my brother the same way, most evenings. Doesn't stop me from being glad of the company I've got now. Grief and gladness aren't always standing on opposite sides of a room, Josephine. Sometimes they're sitting right next to each other, same as we are. They sat that way a while longer, the two of them, until the purple went to full dark and the first stars came hard and cold over the ridge, and neither one of them felt any particular need to fill the quiet with more than what had already been said. She went up the hill on her own that second week. Hadn't planned to. Had gone out to cut the last of the yarrow along the fence line for drying, and her feet had simply carried her up past the barn without asking her leave. The marker stood as it always stood. She saw the grass wanted scything again. Saw a season's worth of dust had settled deep into the cut letters Thomas. Louisa. Taken by the fever, so she knelt, cleaned the dust from the letters with the hem of her apron and a little water from the canteen at her belt, the way you'd wash a child's face. Set a few sprigs of yarrow at the foot of the board, because the dead ought to have something growing near them, even in a dry country. That was when her hand caught on something in the grass, half buried at the base of the marker, gone green-black with rust, small enough that she might have missed it entirely if her fingers hadn't brushed the cold curve of it by accident. A canteen. Metal. Old. Not the kind a rancher carries on horseback, smaller than that, the kind a man might keep on a shelf or in a saddlebag, close at hand for a short walk. She turned it over in her palms. The stopper was gone, lost somewhere in 2 years of weather, and around the mouth of it, crusted deep into the metal itself, was a residue she didn't recognize. Not rust, rust she knew. Rust was a color she'd seen her whole life on every tool her father ever owned. This was different, paler, almost chalky where it had dried, with a faint greenish cast at the edges that made something in her stomach turn over, before her mind had even finished the thought. She sat back on her heels in the grass, the canteen cold and strange in her two hands, and looked at it a long moment. Because it didn't belong here. Because a fever doesn't leave a canteen half buried at the foot of a grave marker, 2 years gone, corroded in a way that plain rust never corroded. Because she stopped herself there. Because she didn't know anything yet. Because a canteen in the grass could mean nothing at all. A ranch hand's water. Dropped and forgotten. The residue just some mineral in the well water. Nothing more sinister than hard water, and 2 winters of weather working on old tin. That was probably all it was. Probably. Except her hands had gone cold around the metal, and it wasn't the wind doing that. She did not know yet what she was holding. She only knew, sitting there on the hill with the yarrow at her knees, and the wind moving through the grass the way it always moved. Indifferent to everything, that she was not going to leave it in the ground. She didn't show it to Garrett that night. Told herself there was no rush, that it was likely nothing, that a new wife going to her husband with a rusted canteen. A bad feeling was no way to start a marriage built on plain, careful trades. She wrapped it instead in a scrap of cloth and set it at the bottom of the small trunk she'd carried from her father's house, under the good shawl, where she'd know exactly where it was, and nobody else would think to look. Then she went down to the kitchen and helped Connie with the supper, because there were 40 things that needed doing before dark, and because keeping her hands busy was the only way she knew to keep her mind from circling back, again and again, to a hillside grave and a rusted piece of tin that shouldn't have been there at all. Out the window, past the barn, the light was going gold and then gray, the way it did every evening in this valley, patient, unbothered, the way it had likely gone gray over that hill. The very week 2 people died of what everyone called a fever, and nobody, as far as Josephine could tell, had ever once thought to ask about again. She set the table, poured the coffee, watched her husband come in from the pens, tired and easy and entirely unaware that somewhere under his own roof, in a trunk at the foot of a bed, sat a small cold thing that might one day split his whole world open. Not tonight, she told herself. Not yet. But soon. 3 weeks. That was how long the canteen sat wrapped in cloth at the bottom of Josephine's trunk before she stopped telling herself it meant nothing, because it wouldn't leave her alone, because she'd catch herself standing at the stove, hands moving through some task she'd done 1,000 times, and her mind would be back up on that hill, kneeling in the grass, metal gone cold in her palms. Which was foolish. She knew that a rusted canteen, old water gone bad in old tin, that was all it likely was, except she'd stopped believing that around the 2nd week, and she couldn't have said exactly when. There was, too, a smaller worry sitting alongside the larger one, the ledger entry she'd read that first week. Water rights, north section, a sum that didn't quite balance against the lines around it. She found occasion to look again, a fortnight later, under the excuse of fetching a receipt Connie needed, and found the entry gone. Not crossed out, not corrected. Simply gone, the page recopied clean in Wendell's careful hand, as though the original figure had never existed at all. She said nothing about it. Not yet. A woman who accuses a man's own cousin of tampering with his books on the strength of a single half-remembered number is a woman who sounds, even to her own ear, like she's inventing trouble to keep herself occupied. She told herself that firmly. She believed it less each time she told it to herself. She took the canteen to town on a Tuesday, tucked inside a market basket under a cloth, like she was smuggling something, which she supposed she was. Doc Fenwick's shop sat 2 doors down from the mercantile, a narrow front with bottles in the window and a smell inside like camphor and dust. He was an old man, gone soft in the middle, gentle-handed, the kind of doctor who delivered half the valley and buried the other half, and made his peace with both a long time ago. He turned the canteen over in his hands, studied the crusted residue at the mouth of it through a small glass, was quiet long enough that Josephine's pulse climbed before he said a single word. "Where'd you find this, Mrs. Corrigan? Does it matter?" "It might." He set the glass down, looked at her over it. "This isn't rust. Rust I could tell you about in my sleep. This is something else. Some kind of mineral residue, maybe. Or something added." A pause. "I'd want to test it proper before I'd swear to anything. I've got a chemist friend in the county seat does that kind of work." "How long would that take?" "A few weeks. Maybe longer, depending on the mail." He looked at her again, careful now, the way a doctor looks at a patient who might not want to hear what comes next. "You're not going to tell me where you found it?" "Not yet." "All right." He wrapped it back in the cloth, gentle, like it was something that might still hurt someone. "I won't ask. Twice." Corrigan. If this turns out to be what I think it might be turning out to be, you'll want to know who else was standing near whatever it was that got poured out. Poured out. The word sat in Josephine's chest the whole ride home. Heavy as a stone she'd swallowed whole. She didn't tell Garrett. Not that week. Told herself there was no sense worrying him over a guess. From an old doctor with a magnifying glass. Not until there was something solid to put in his hands. She told herself a lot of things that autumn. Some of them were even true. What was true, plainly true, was this. Ironwood Ranch had become, somewhere in those first weeks, something close to hers. She knew the pantry down to the last jar, knew which hand took his coffee thick as tar and which one couldn't stomach it black at all. Knew Conti's silences well enough now to read the difference between the one that meant leave me be and the one that meant come closer. I've something to say and I'm working up to it. And she'd learned Wendell Corrigan a little better too. Which was to say, she'd learned to watch him the way you watch weather on the wrong side of the sky. He was pleasant, endlessly, exhaustingly pleasant, complimented her stew, complimented her handwriting on the ranch ledgers, which she'd started keeping straighter than they'd been kept in years. Complimented once, the way she'd settled in so quick, so easy. Like you were always meant to be here. Mrs. Corrigan, and something about the way he said, made the back of her neck go cold. She didn't know why yet. She would. The rider came down from the pass on a gray morning in the fourth week, and Josephine knew before he'd even swung off his horse that whatever he was carrying, it wasn't good news. Men didn't ride that hard over easy news. He came into the kitchen turning his hat in both hands, the way men do when they've got something to say, and no good way to say it. Boss, there's a survey crew put up at the hotel in Redstone Crossing. Railroad men. Been out walking the flats with their glasses and their chains. Garrett's face didn't move. That was the thing Josephine had learned about her husband. By then the stiller his face went, the worse the news underneath it. Who's heading them? Company agent. Come in on yesterday's stage. The rider hesitated. Actually hesitated like the name itself cost him something to say. Name of Reeve, Dalton Reeve. Said he'd done business in this valley years back. Said folks would remember him. Josephine had a plate in her hands. She set it down on the table, very carefully, so it wouldn't crack, so nobody would see how her fingers had gone bloodless around the rim of it. Garrett didn't notice, Connie did. Connie noticed everything. You know the name, Connie said to her later, low, under the sound of the men still talking by the door. I knew it once. Josephine's voice came out steadier than she felt. A long time ago. I'd hoped never to know it again. Out the window, past the barn, the hill stood dark against the gray morning, keeping its two graves the way it always kept them. Patient, unbothered, Josephine looked at it a long moment, and understood, with a cold certainty settling into her stomach like a stone dropped down a well, that whatever this valley was about to become, that hill was going to be standing in the middle of it. She rode into Redstone Crossing 3 days later with Garrett, for supplies, for the look of an ordinary errand. It was not an ordinary errand. She knew that the moment they tied up outside the Mercantile, and she saw him. Dalton Reeve stood across the street outside the hotel, in a fine gray coat that had never once seen a day's honest dust, talking easy with two of the county men like he owned the sidewalk beneath his boots. A second man stood a few paces back from him, saying nothing, watching the street the way a dog watches a gate, broad through the chest, a dark coat gone shiny at the elbows, a face that gave away nothing at all. Josephine didn't know his name yet. She would have cause to learn it soon enough. Reeve had not changed. That was the first thought that landed, sharp and unwelcome. The same handsome ease, the same way of standing that made a whole street rearrange itself around him, without seeming to try. His eyes found hers across the road, and they did not startle, they warmed. That was the worst of it. They warmed like he was glad, like there was nothing at all between them but old fondness, worn soft with time. Josephine Whitlock, he said, coming across the road with both hands out, easy, unhurried, like 9 years hadn't happened to either one of them. Or is it Corrigan now? You've done well for yourself. He said it loud. Loud enough for the nearest ears to catch, and every word of it dressed up neat as a compliment. I'd heard the valley had a new mistress out at Ironwood, Reeve went on. I never dreamed it would turn out to be you. I'd heard the railroad had sent a man. Josephine did not give him her hand. I never dreamed it would turn out to be you. Something flickered behind his easy smile. Gone fast. Not fast enough. We should talk, old friends. His voice dropped, pitched just for her now. There's a great deal happening in this valley, Josephine, and a great deal of it touches your husband's grass. It would be a shame for old friends to end up standing on opposite sides of a thing when one quiet word between them might set it all right. My husband settles his own business, Mr. Reeve. He doesn't send his wife to do it for him. She let that land the shape of it, the exact mirror of the errand her own father had once sent her, ons, months back 40 miles, and a folded letter. She saw the flicker cross his face again and knew he'd caught it too. Who's your associate? Josephine asked, with a nod toward the man in the dark coat, more to change the ground under his feet than out of any real curiosity. Business partner. Handles matters. I've no patience for myself. Reeves' smile didn't waver, though something behind it seemed to close over, quick, like a shutter dropped on a window. Cole Briggs. He keeps to himself. Mostly. You needn't concern yourself with him. Josephine looked at the man called Briggs a moment longer than was polite. He looked back at her without expression, the way you'd look at a fence post. You were deciding whether to move. If you've a word for Corrigan, she said, turning back to Reeve, ride out to Ironwood and say it to his face. He's not hard to find. He's the one who doesn't hide behind a company. She turned and walked back toward the mercantile, but her heart was going hard in her chest and her hands had gone cold inside her gloves, and she knew with the particular, bitter certainty of a woman who had once loved a man and lived 9 years regretting it that Dalton Reeve had not ridden into this valley for a railroad alone. He'd just told her so, and smiled the whole time he did it. She told Garrett that night. Had to. Couldn't sit across a supper table from him with a secret that size in between plates. I knew him, she said, once the kitchen was dark and Connie had gone to bed and it was only the two of them and the last of the fire. Before I married, my father and Dalton Reeve ran a freight line together. Partners. He courted me a whole summer, back when I was young enough to believe every word out of a handsome man's mouth. Garrett said nothing, waited. Which she was learning was his way. Give a thing room to finish itself before you go reaching for it. Then one morning he was gone, Josephine said, east with the season's money. The whole cash box. Every promise he'd ever made me. Gone with him. Left my father to answer for the debts alone. It broke the freight line clean in half. It's the reason there was ever a debt for me to come apologize for. That first day I rode out here. She looked at her hands folded tight in her lap. He ruined us once already, Garrett. And now he's back. With a railroad standing behind him instead of a cash box. He's brought a man with him too, Cole Briggs. Didn't like the look of him at all. The fire popped once, low, and neither of them moved to feed it. And you never told me. It wasn't an accusation. Not quite, but it wasn't nothing either. I didn't think I'd ever have to. Josephine met his eyes. I buried that whole summer a long time ago, Garrett. I didn't think it would come walking back into this valley in a fine gray coat. He reached over in the dark, laid his rough hand over both of hers, where they sat cold in her lap and left it there. Then we'll be ready for him, he said. Not I'll handle it. Will. Josephine heard the word, held onto it the way you hold onto a rope somebody's finally thrown you. She did not take her hands away. The trouble started small, the way trouble in a valley always seems to start small right up until the morning it isn't small anymore. First it was a section of fence along the north pasture. Cut clean, 3 days after Reeve rode out to Ironwood uninvited and sat his horse at the porch rail, while Garrett stood on the step and told him, plain, that there'd be no signing anything. Not that day and not any day after it. Pruitt found it at first light. 3 long strands of good wire cut through with something sharper than any tool a cattle thief would ordinarily bother carrying, and stood staring at it a long moment before he rode back to report it. Jaw set so tight Josephine could see the muscle working in it clear across the yard. Clean cuts, he told Garrett. Not chewed through, not snapped in a storm. Somebody wanted us to know they'd been there. Then it was cattle. 11 head gone from the same pasture inside a week, and no honest trail leading anywhere a man could follow. Then it was Ezra Doyle. He was one of the younger hands, not yet 20, all elbows and easy laughter. The kind of boy who still thought the whole world was mostly kind because it hadn't gotten around to teaching him otherwise. He'd drawn the night watch out past the north fence, alone, 3 nights after the cattle went missing. He came back before dawn on a horse gone lathered and wild-eyed, slumped so far over the saddle that the horse itself seemed to know something was wrong and had slowed to a careful, frightened walk all on its own. Josephine heard the commotion before she understood it, heard Connie's sharp intake of breath at the window, heard Garrett's boots hit the porch floor at a dead run. Because Ezra Doyle had a bullet through his shoulder, and blood soaked black down half his shirt. And he was talking in the loose, frightened way of a man who has lost more blood than his body has patience for. Man in the dark, he kept saying, over and over, while Josephine cut the shirt away and pressed a folded cloth hard against the wound, the way Doc Fenwick had shown half the valley to do in a pinch. Didn't say a word. Just raised up and shot. Didn't even ask my name first. Did you see him? Garrett's voice had gone to that flat, dangerous quiet Josephine had learned to be afraid of on his behalf. Not her own big fellow. Dark coat, rode off south, toward the crossing. Ezra's eyes rolled, found Josephine's held there like she was the only steady thing left in a world gone sideways. Didn't mean to bleed on your porch, ma'am. Hush, Josephine said, pressing harder, keeping her voice level, even though her hands were shaking underneath it. Bleed wherever you like. Just don't you dare stop talking to me. Big fellow, dark coat. The description settled into Josephine's chest like a stone dropped in still water, sending its ripples out in every direction at once. She had stood on a street in Redstone Crossing not 4 days before and looked at a man who matched that description down to the last detail, standing a few careful paces behind Dalton Reeve, saying nothing, watching everything. She did not say his name out loud. Not yet. Not with Ezra's blood still warm on her hands and Garrett's face gone the color of old ash beside her. They got him inside. Got Doc Fenwick riding out inside the hour. The boy would live. The doctor said so plain. Once he dug the bullet free and packed the wound, and Ezra had gone the pale gray white of a man who'd come close to a thing and only just missed it. But something in the kitchen had changed by morning. Josephine could feel it the way you feel weather turning before the sky's even gone dark. This wasn't a debt collector anymore. Wasn't a smooth man in a fine coat talking easy on a sidewalk. This was a man willing to put a bullet in a boy rotting fence at night. Garrett rode into Redstone Crossing himself the next morning, jaw set, and Josephine went with him because she was not about to sit at home stirring a pot while somebody decided what justice looked like without her in the room. Sheriff Purnell's office sat at the end of the main street, a squat brick building that had always struck Josephine, on the rare occasions she'd passed it, as a place that took itself more seriously than it had any right to. The sheriff himself was a heavy man behind a desk too small for him, with a mustache he was clearly proud of and eyes that would not, Josephine noticed within the first minute, quite settle on Garrett's. A boy's been shot on my own land, Garrett said. No preamble, riding fence, in the dark, by a man nobody around here's ever seen before. I've a fair notion who hired him too, if you'd care to hear it. Cattle thieves are a hard business, Corrigan. You know that as well as I do. This wasn't cattle thieves running from a boy who spooked them. This was a man who raised up and shot first and never said a word. Garrett's voice hadn't risen. It had gone lower instead, which was worse. I want it looked into. Purnell shuffled a paper on his desk that didn't need shuffling. I'll ask around. That's it? You'll ask around? Man, I've got exactly 1 deputy and half a county to cover, and I'll tell you plain, I don't much care to go picking a fight with a railroad company over a stray shot in the dark that nobody but the boy himself can even swear to. The words hung there, a stray shot in the dark, as if Ezra Doyle had imagined the whole of it, as if the blood oaked into the porch boards back at Ironwood was nothing more than a boy's overactive nerves. Josephine felt something cold and clear settle into place behind her ribs. You said railroad company, she said quietly. Nobody in this room mentioned a railroad company, Sheriff. Purnell's eyes flicked to her, away again fast. Everybody knows there's a survey crew in the valley, Mrs. Corrigan. Wasn't any secret to connect. Wasn't it? She held his gaze until he looked away a second time. Funny. It connected itself awful quick in your mind, for a man who says he hasn't looked into anything yet. I understand the county's been slow paying your office lately, Sheriff. I wonder whose money's been filling the gap. It was a guess. A hard, deliberate guess, thrown out to see if it landed anywhere close to true. She watched Purnell's jaw tighten, watched the color climb up past his collar, and knew, with a cold certainty, that it had landed exactly where she'd aimed it. That's a serious thing to say to a lawman, Mrs. Corrigan. It's a serious thing you've done if it's true. I only asked a question. She stood, you needn't answer it today. Garrett's hand found the small of her back, steady, a signal she understood not stop, but not here, not yet. They left without another word. But in the street outside, Garrett stopped, looked back once at the brick building behind them, and said the thing plain, the way he said everything that mattered most to him. He's bought. I think he has been for a while, Josephine said. Then we're not going to find justice sitting behind that desk. No, Josephine agreed. We're going to have to build it ourselves. Out of everybody in this valley who's had enough of being afraid. There was a night in that same stretch when Josephine woke past midnight to the sound of a horse being led quiet from the barn, hooves wrapped, she realized later, in sacking to muffle them against the hardpack. She went to the window in time to see two shapes at the gate: Wendell, unmistakable even in the dark by the way he held himself, and a second rider she didn't recognize, who took something from Wendell's hand, said a few words too low to carry, and rode off north before she'd gathered the nerve to go down and ask what business required midnight and muffled hooves both. She mentioned it to Garrett the next morning, careful, not wanting to sound like a woman inventing shadows out of ordinary darkness. Might have been nothing, Garrett said, though the crease between his brows said he didn't fully believe that himself. Wendell keeps odd hours. Always has. Odd hours are one thing, wrapped hooves are another. He didn't have an answer for that. Neither did she, not yet. But she noticed, over the days that followed, that Wendell's pleasantness had taken on a brittle edge, like a man smiling too hard to keep something else from showing through underneath it. He complimented her twice as often that week and looked at her only half as long while he did it. She started with a supper. It was the only tool she had that she trusted completely: a full pot, a long table, and the particular, stubborn honesty that comes out of people once you've fed them well and let them sit a while. She sent word by every rider heading anywhere there'd be a gathering out at Ironwood come Sunday, a supper for the chapel roof fund. The whole valley welcome, no family turned away regardless of what they could or couldn't put in the plate at the end of it. She cooked for 3 straight days, Connie beside her the whole while, the two of them moving around that enormous kitchen like they'd been doing it together their whole lives instead of a handful of weeks. And they came. Mrs. Holloway rode down from the ridge with her hired boy driving the wagon, 40 head of her own cattle left to fend for a single evening because, as she put it, plain as anything, a woman doesn't get many chances left in her life to stand with somebody worth standing with, and I mean to take this one. Lars Jorgensen came in from the North Wells, with his whole family crowded onto a hay wagon, careful with his English, but not with the warmth in his handshake, saying only that his father had crossed an ocean for water that was his to keep, and he did not intend to lose it to a railroad without a fight. Men who'd whispered plenty about the Corrigan wedding, back when it was fresh gossip, had come too. Josephine suspected, at least partly to see for themselves what all the whispering had actually amounted to. She fed them first, talked after. That was the whole of her wisdom on the matter, and it had never once failed her. There was a moment, midway through serving, when old Tuck came through the line and looked at the spread. She'd laid out the roasted meats, the bread still warm, the pies lined up along the far table like a small golden fortification, and said, to nobody in particular, loud enough for half the barn to hear, "Well, if this is what the Corrigan Fisib serves up when she's worried about a railroad, I'd surely hate to see what she does when she's happy about something." It got a laugh, the good kind, the kind that loosens a room that's been holding itself too tight for too long, and Josephine felt something in her own chest loosen, right along with it. Garrett stood up in the lantern-lit barn once the plates were mostly cleared, 40 families or near it gathered in front of him, and told them plain what Reeve had offered him days before. On the porch, his hill left untouched, his grass left whole, in exchange for his name on a company right-of-way that would cut every small outfit in the valley clean in half. "I haven't signed it," Garrett said, "and I'm not going to. But I'll tell you the truth of it plain because you deserve the truth more than you deserve my comfort. A boy on my payroll got shot 3 nights back for doing nothing but his job in the dark, and the sheriff in this county has already decided, before he's lifted a single finger to look into it, exactly which side of this he's standing on." A murmur went through the barn. Fear, mostly. Some anger underneath it not yet fully lit. "I can't fight this alone," Garrett said. "My money's no good against a company charter and a bought badge, but 40 families standing together, saying one true thing with one voice, that's a different kind of weight altogether." They didn't all agree at once. There were frightened men in that barn. Men Reeve could still reach if he tried hard enough, men with more to lose than they had courage to spend. But Josephine moved among them with the coffee pot the whole while, name by name, cup by cup. And where a man wavered, she didn't argue with him. She only refilled his cup and reminded him, quiet, which side of a coming railroad line his own grandfather's water sat on. By the time the last wagon rolled out that night, the valley had something it hadn't had a week before, a place to bring its fear, and a reason, finally, to stop being afraid of it alone. The stake went into the ground 4 days after that. Josephine found it herself, walking up the hill on a gray morning with a fresh handful of yarrow for the marker, the way she did most weeks now, the way that had stopped feeling like a chore and started feeling like something closer to a promise kept. She saw it from 30 feet off and stopped dead in the grass. Iron shod, driven deep, a strip of red cloth tied at the crown of it, and a number burned into the wood beneath the cloth, and it stood not 4 feet from Thomas and Louisa's marker like a nail waiting patient for a hammer that hadn't swung yet. Someone had walked up onto this hill, stepped over the scythe grass in the yarrow she tended every week with her own 2 hands, and marked it, for a railroad, like it was nothing more than any other stretch of empty ground in the valley. Josephine stood very still a long moment. Then she walked forward, took the stake in both hands, and pulled it straight up, out of the earth, roots of dirt and grass coming with it, her arms shaking with something that wasn't quite effort and wasn't quite grief either. She carried it down the hill the whole long way, stood it up against the barn wall, and waited for her husband to cut in from the pens and see it for himself. Garrett came in at dusk, saw the stake propped against the barn before he'd even swung down off his horse, and Josephine watched his whole body go still in the particular way a man goes still when the world has just laid a hand directly on something he loves and can't protect. On the hill, he said. Not a question. 4 feet from the marker. He picked the stake up, turned it once in his hands. Slow, the way you'd turn over something you badly wanted to break in half, and were making yourself wait before you did it. They mean to run the line up the valley floor, he said. Quiet. Straight up the middle. Cheapest grade there is. And the cheapest grade runs right over the toe of that hill. He looked out toward the dark window, toward the hill he couldn't see from here but knew by heart regardless. They'd move them, he said. That's what this means. Dig up my brother and his wife and set them off to the side someplace so a company can save itself a mile of track. They can't. They can do near anything with a charter and a company lawyer, and a right-of-way the territory wants bad enough. He set the stake down against the wall, careful, like it might still bite him. Money buys a great deal in this country, Josephine. I've learned this week, it doesn't buy you out of a railroad. Josephine looked at the stake leaning there in the last of the light, at the red cloth stirring faint in the evening wind, and felt something harden in her chest that hadn't been there a month ago. Something that had started, she realized, the very first night she'd stood in this kitchen and refused to flinch at a debt that wasn't hers. Then we don't let them, she said. Whatever it takes. We don't let them. She overheard it 3 nights later, entirely by accident, the way the worst truths always seem to arrive sideways, uninvited, at exactly the moment you're not braced for them. She'd gone out to the barn past dark for a jar of preserves stored on the high shelf, a small errand, nothing more, and she'd have announced herself the moment she came through the door if she hadn't caught the low murmur of voices from the far side, near the tack room, and something in the tone of them made her feet go quiet instead of loud. Wendell's voice. And beneath it, unmistakable, smooth as poured oil, Dalton Reeves. He'll never sign it while she's standing behind him, Wendell was saying. You've seen the way she's turned this valley. 40 families in his barn a week back, all of them ready to march on your surveyors with pitchforks if she asked them to. She's a complication, Reeve agreed, unbothered. Not an unsolvable one. And the hill? The hill's leverage, Wendell. It's always been leverage. A man doesn't fight nearly as hard for a grave as he thinks he's going to, once you make it plain enough what it's going to cost him not to bend. A pause. Josephine stood frozen in the dark of the barn, one hand pressed flat against the rough wood of a stall, hardly breathing. A loose board creaked somewhere beneath her shifting weight, and her whole body went rigid, certain for one long, terrible second that the sound had carried. It hadn't. The voices continued unbroken, and she let her breath out slow through her teeth. You'll get your piece of this, Reeve went on. The moment the right-of-way clears, that strip along your own east fence triples in value overnight. You know that better than I do. You've been counting on it a good deal longer than I've been standing in this valley, and Briggs has already reminded that boy of yours what happens to men who ride fence and see too much. He won't be the last if it comes. Josephine's stomach turned over entirely. There it was. The name spoken plain, in her husband's own barn, tying the man in the dark coat directly to the blood that had soaked black down Ezra Doyle's shirt 3 nights before. I've been counting on a great many things a good deal longer than you know, Wendell said, and there was something in his voice now that Josephine hadn't heard from him before. Something flatter, colder, something with old grief curdled somewhere down underneath it, gone sour with time. I was owed half this ranch outright, Reeve. Out it. And it slipped through my fingers by 6 weeks in a wedding I wasn't even given the courtesy of an invitation to. Careful, Reeve said, and for the first time his easy tone had an edge to it. That kind of talk is exactly the sort of thing a man ought to keep buried. The way you kept the other thing buried. 2 years buried, as I understand it. Silence. A long, terrible silence. And Josephine's heart was going so hard in her chest she was certain, for one wild second, that both men must surely be able to hear it clear across the barn. That's not a subject for you, Wendell said finally, low, dangerous in a way she'd never once heard from him. Not for you, not for anyone. No, Reeve agreed. Smooth again. The edge folded back away as quick as it had appeared. Of course not. I'm only saying, Wendell, a man who's already proven himself willing to solve one inconvenient problem quietly. That's a useful sort of man to have standing beside me. That's all I meant by it. Josephine did not move. Could not have moved if the barn had caught fire around her in that exact moment. Because 2 years buried sat in the air between those two men like something with weight to it. Like something that had a name, and a shape, and a hill it belonged to. Because Thomas and Louisa Corrigan had died 2 years ago. Of a fever, everyone said. A fever nobody had ever once thought to question. Because she was standing in the dark not 30 feet from a rusted, poisoned canteen wrapped in cloth at the bottom of her own trunk, and a doctor in town who'd looked at it with careful, worried eyes and said the words poured out like they cost him something to say. She backed away from the stall, slow, silent, every step deliberate, and did not breathe easy again until she was clear of the barn entirely and standing under the wide, indifferent stars, her whole body shaking in the cold. She had come to this valley to say a sorry that wasn't hers. She had not come looking for a murder. But she had found the shadow of one anyway, and now that she'd heard it spoken of, out loud, in her own husband's barn, there was no folding it small enough to set back down again. She was going to have to tell him everything. The canteen, the doctor. Now this, and the name Cole Briggs, sitting in her mind now like a second stone dropped down the same deep well, and she understood, standing there under that cold October sky, with the hill rising dark and silent above the barn roof, that whatever came next in this valley, it was no longer only about a railroad, or a debt, or even a grave. It was about a family that had already once before paid a price nobody had known to grieve properly, and a man standing close enough to that family's table to do it again. She told him everything that same night, standing in the kitchen with the lamp turned low, because some things don't get easier for waiting until morning. They only get heavier. The canteen first, pulled from the trunk, unwrapped from its cloth, set on the table between them like something that might still bite. Then Doc Fenkit used, poured out. Then the barn. Wendell's voice. Reeve's voice, 2 years buried. And last of all, the name that had settled into her like a splinter she couldn't work free. Cole Briggs, the man in the dark coat, the man who had put a bullet through Ezra Doyle, and never once said a word while he did it. Garrett didn't move through any of it. Didn't reach for the canteen, didn't reach for her. Just stood with both hands flat on the table edge, like a man bracing against something only he could feel coming. Connie had come down partway through, drawn by voices at an hour the house was usually silent, and stood now in the doorway with a shawl thrown over her nightdress, her face gone still and pale in the lamplight. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Josephine had learned, these past weeks, that Connie's silences carried whole speeches inside them, and this one, she understood without being told, was grief and fury standing shoulder to shoulder, waiting their turn. Say that last part again, Garrett said when Josephine finished. Quiet. Too quiet. Reeves said Wendell had already proven he could solve an inconvenient problem quietly, said it like a compliment. Wendell told him to leave it buried. 2 years buried. My brother's been dead 2 years, I know. That's not a coincidence, Josephine, I know that too. He picked the canteen up then. Finally. Turned it over slow in his hands, the way she'd turned it over on that hillside a month back, and grief and fury both moved across his face at once, so tangled together, she couldn't have said which one was underneath which. He stood at my wedding, Garrett said. He didn't. He wasn't there. I remember thinking that was strange and letting it go because I had 100 other things on my mind that day. Garrett. I let it go, he said again, like the words themselves had teeth. I let a great many things go with that man, because he's blood, and because I told myself blood earns a man patience that strangers don't. Except patience isn't the same thing as blindness, is it? I've been blind a long while and telling myself it was patience. Connie spoke then for the first time, her voice rough. I watched that boy grow up thinking the sun rose out of his own back pocket, Garrett Corrigan. I never once liked the way he looked at things that weren't his. I should have said so plainer, years back. I'm sorry I didn't. None of us said it plain enough, Josephine said. That's done now. We say it plain from here on. Josephine reached across the table, laid her hand over Garrett's, the way he'd laid his over hers that first hard night after Reeve rode into town. We don't know the whole of it yet, she said. We know enough to be afraid. We don't know enough to prove it. Not in front of a judge. Not in front of anyone who'd need more than a rusted canteen and a conversation I overheard in the dark. Then we find the rest of it. We will, she held his eyes. But Garrett, whatever we find, however bad it turns out to be, you are not going to face it alone, not this, not any of it. Something in his face cracked open, just slightly, just for a moment, before he folded it back down into the careful stillness she'd learned to read as his particular kind of courage. No, he said, I don't suppose I am. Dalton Reeve rode out to Ironwood 4 days later in the fine gray coat, easy in the saddle, like a man arriving to collect on something he already considered settled. Josephine saw him coming up the road from the kitchen window and went out to the porch before he'd even reached the gate, because she was not going to let him step foot inside a house where Wendell's name had just started tasting like poison. Garrett came out and stood beside her. Reeve reined up at the step, touched his hat, easy as a Sunday caller. Corrigan. Mrs. Corrigan. He did not get down from the horse. I'll not take much of your morning. I've come to do you a kindness, which is more than most men in my position would bother extending, so I'll ask you both to hear the whole of it before you set the dog on me. Say it from the horse, Garrett said. Fair enough. Reeve folded his hands over the saddle horn, comfortable, unbothered, a man laying out a hand of cards he was certain he'd already won. The line's coming through this valley, Corrigan. That much is decided well above both our heads. What isn't decided yet is the exact route. And the route, as it happens, is the one thing I've still got some say over. Get to it. The cheap grade runs the valley floor, cuts every small outfit from here to the North Wells clean in half, fences their water off behind track no cow can cross. Reeve's voice stayed pleasant the entire time, which was somehow worse than if he'd let any heat into it at all. It ruins the little men, I'm sorry to say, and it runs, as you already know, straight over that hill of yours. You've made your point once already. On this same porch. I'm offering it again, because circumstances have changed a little since then. Reeve's eyes flicked briefly to Josephine. One word from you in the right ear, Corrigan, and the line bends east at the pass. Comes back around below your south fence. Your grass untouched. Your hill untouched. Your dead left exactly where you buried them. And in exchange, your name on the company's right-of-way for the valley floor, at the company's price. Your voice at the hearing, telling the commissioner the route's a fair one. The little outfits follow where you lead, Corrigan. Everyone in this valley knows that. You sign, they fold, the line goes through, and your family's graves stay put. He spread his hands, reasonable, almost generous. Everyone walks away with something they can live with. The porch went quiet. Somewhere out past the barn a nighthawk called, though it was still full morning, and the sound of it landed strange and wrong in the silence. Josephine understood, standing there, the exact shape of the trap, how neat it was, how it wore the Reeve was offering Garrett his own hill for the price of every neighbor he had. And if I don't sign, Garrett said, then the cheap grade stands, goes up the middle. Your neighbors get cut in two, and your brother. Reeve's smile didn't move an inch. Your brother gets moved after all, to the county's convenience, which is nobody's convenience at all. If we're honest about it, you lose either way, Corrigan. I'm only offering you the version where you lose a little less. There's another matter, too. I'll not raise it in front of your wife on her own porch out of respect. Raise it, Josephine said. Reeve looked at her. For just a moment the warmth went out of his face entirely, and she saw the man underneath it, plain, the one who'd ridden east 9 years ago with a cash box that wasn't his, and never once looked back. As you like. He said it flat now, done dressing it up. I hold your father's old paper, Mrs. Corrigan. All of it. The freight line debt from 9 years back and every dollar of interest that's piled onto it since. I bought it up quiet when I first came into this valley. A man likes to know where his leverage sits before he ever has need of it. That debt was settled the day my husband forgave the $1,100. That was a different debt. This is the old one. The real one. He let it hang there, Deliberate, cruel in the particular way that comes dressed up as simple business. Near $4,000, with the years counted in, and it's mine to call whenever I please. Your father's one word from me away from the road, Josephine. Persuade your husband to be sensible, and I'll tear the whole of it up myself. Your father dies in his own bed, a solvent man. Cross me, he said, and I'll put him out of that freight yard before the month's end, and there won't be a soul in this valley who can stop me doing it. He touched his hat once more. Turn the horse, think on it. Both you, there's no hurry. The hearing's not for 3 weeks yet. He rode off down the road at an easy walk. A man who'd said his piece and was entirely sure of it. Garrett stood at the rail a long time after the hoof beats had faded to nothing. He'd do it, he said finally. Put your father out. He did it once before. Only slower that time. Then here's the whole trade laid bare. Garrett's voice had gone flat, the way it did when something in him had settled past anger into something colder and more useful. I sign his paper. The line goes over your neighbors and around my hill. Your father keeps his yard. Or I fight it and maybe save the valley, and Reeve ruins your father to spite the both of us for the trouble. He turned to look at her. That's the choice, Josephine. I'll not pretend it's a clean one. Tell me, what am I to do about your father? And Josephine Corrigan stood on the porch of a house that had become, somewhere in these last weeks, entirely her own, and understood that her husband was asking her the largest question of her whole life, asking it as an equal. Whatever she answered, he would weigh it as if it were his own choice and not hers alone to carry. You're to do nothing about my father, she said. My father is my grief, not your bargain to trade away. She drew a breath. If you sign that paper to save him, you sell every family in this valley to buy back my father's pride. I'll not have my name anywhere near that. I'd rather see him in the road with his head up than kept in his yard by a thing like Dalton Reeve. Her voice shook. She held it steady anyway. We fight it, Garrett. The line, the hill, the debt, all of it, out in the open where a man like Reeve does his worst work in the dark and can't stand the light. And we don't do it alone. He thinks the little men fold the second you lead them into a corner. Let's show him exactly where you lead them instead. Garrett looked at her a long moment. Then something older and warmer moved into his face, a good deal more dangerous to them both, because it meant there was more now to lose than either of them had bargained for at the start. I married better than I knew, he said. Silas Whitlock came to Ironwood 2 days later, at Josephine's asking, and brought with him a strong box of yellowed papers he'd kept hidden under a floorboard for 9 years' freight ledgers, bills of lading, a discharge signed, and witnessed the same sum. Dalton Reeve had disappeared east with the company's cash. I never showed a soul, Silas admitted, hands trembling around the box like it might still burn him after all this time. Thought it'd only make me look the fool twice over. Once for trusting him, once for keeping proof of it and never using it. You're going to use it now, Josephine said. Eleanor. His voice cracked on it. He pressed a hand briefly over his eyes, and Josephine understood, with a small ache, that he'd meant to say her own name, and found her mother's sitting there instead, the way grief sometimes plays tricks on an old man's tongue even 11 years on. Forgive me, Josephine, if this goes wrong. If I stand up in that courthouse and it costs us the yard anyway, then it costs us the yard with the truth finally standing in the room, Papa. Not a lie you've carried alone for 9 years. She took his shaking hands in both of hers, the way Garrett had once taken hers in the dark. You sent me 40 miles to say a sorry that wasn't mine. I've carried your shame long enough for the both of us. I'm setting it down now. For good. Her father's eyes filled, and for once in his life he did not look away from her. Garrett rode out to find Wendell himself, 3 days after Silas brought his strongbox to Ironwood, and Josephine did not go with him. Some conversations, she understood. A man needed to have alone, whatever the cost of standing outside the door while it happened. He came back an hour later, jaw tight, saying little. What little he did say, he said, standing in the kitchen doorway, still in his coat like a man who hadn't yet decided whether he was staying. I asked him plain, Garrett said. Told him what we knew. Gave him the chance to tell me himself before it ever reached a courtroom. What did he say? Denied it. Called me a fool for believing a rusted canteen over my own blood. Garrett's hands, Josephine noticed, were not quite steady. Then he asked me plain, Josephine, whether I meant to stand up in front of the whole valley and hang my own cousin for the sake of a railroad grade, like that was the whole size of it, like Thomas and Louisa were a railroad grade. What did you tell him? I told him I meant to stand up in front of the whole valley and tell the truth, and that if the truth happened to hang him, he'd hung himself a long time before I ever opened my mouth about it. He let out a breath that seemed to take something heavy along with it. He didn't have an answer for that. Just looked at me a long moment, and then looked away, and I understood, standing there, that some part of him had already known this day was coming. Had known it for 2 years maybe, and had gone on smiling anyway, because smiling was easier than the alternative. Josephine crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. There are some griefs, she was learning, that don't have a proper shape until you've stood inside them a while. Doc Fenwick's letter came back from the county seat 9 days before the hearing, and Josephine read it, standing in his narrow front room, with her heart going so hard she could hear it in her own ears. The residue in the canteen was white arsenic, common enough as rat poison, common enough as sheep dip, common enough that half the ranches in the valley likely kept a tin of it somewhere in a barn or a smokehouse without a second thought. Except the chemist had gone further than she'd asked, had matched the particular grain and mixing of it against 3 known suppliers in the territory. And the ledger from the one supplier who'd sold that exact batch showed a purchase made 2 years back, in the weeks before the fever, took Thomas and Louisa Corrigan, bought under the name W. Corrigan, paid in cash, signed for personal. Josephine sat down hard in the nearest chair, the letter shaking in her hands, because she'd known. She'd known since the barn, since 2 years buried, had hung in the dark between 2 men who thought no one was listening. Known it the way you know a storm's coming before the first cloud shows itself. Knowing a thing and holding proof of it in your own 2 hands were, she was learning, 2 entirely different kinds of terrible. "There's more," Doc Fenwick said gently, watching her face. "I asked around. Quiet, the way you asked me to. There's a hand who used to work your well maintenance, moved on to the Hendricks place last spring. Says he recalls Wendell Corrigan out at the well alone more than once that same summer. Told him he was checking the pump. Hand thought nothing of it at the time. Man's cousin to the owner after all. Why would he think twice? Would he say so? In front of a commissioner. I expect he would if asked the right way by the right person." The old doctor looked at her. "Careful, Mrs. Corrigan. You understand what you're about to do to that family." "I understand what was already done to it," Josephine said. 2 years before I ever rode into this valley. I'm only the one unlucky enough to have found where they buried the proof. The night before the hearing, the whole household sat late around the kitchen table, unable to settle to sleep, the way people gather together without quite admitting that's what they're doing when a thing large enough is waiting for them at dawn. Silas went over his papers a 3rd time, though he had them near memorized by then. Connie mended a tear in Garrett's good shirt that didn't strictly need mending, her needle moving in small, precise stitches that seemed to steady her more than the shirt itself required. Garrett sat by the fire, turning his hat in his hands the way he'd done that very first night, though Josephine noticed he no longer needed to look tired to justify the stillness in his face. Some stillnesses, she was learning, simply belonged to a man, regardless of the hour. "You're frightened," Josephine said to him quietly, once the others had drifted off toward their beds, and it was only the 2 of them left by the dying fire. "I am." He didn't try to dress it up as anything else, not of losing the hill, not even of losing the valley, God help me, though I'd have said different a month back. "I'm frightened of standing in that room tomorrow and watching my own blood answer for what he did to my brother. There's no trade to be struck there, Josephine, no fair bargain waiting on the other side of it. Just grief, plain and ugly, with nowhere left to hide from it." "Then don't hide from it," Josephine said. "Stand in the grief same as you'd stand in anything else. I'll be standing in it right alongside you. So will your neighbors. So will 40 families who've decided they'd rather face something ugly together than pretend it isn't there at all." Garrett looked at her a long moment in the firelight, and something in his face, not careful now, not guarded, just plainly, entirely open, told her the words had landed exactly where she'd meant them to. "I don't know what I did," he said, "to deserve riding into tomorrow with you beside me instead of alone." "You forgave a debt that wasn't worth forgiving," Josephine said, and asked a stranger a question like she mattered, instead of like she was a burden. "That's what you did." It was enough, still enough. They sat together until the fire burned down to coals, and neither one of them said very much more, because by then there wasn't very much more that needed saying. The land office at the county seat had never held so many boots. They came in from the valley in wagons and on horseback, 40 families deep, filling the plain room and standing 3 rows deep along the walls once the benches gave out entirely. The circuit commissioner sat behind a table at the front, with the survey maps spread before him, a spare gray man who looked, Josephine thought, like a man who'd condemned a great deal of country in his time and never once let it agree with him. Dalton Reeves sat off to one side with the company lawyer, easy in his fine coat, a folder of papers at his elbow, entirely at his leisure. Josephine did not see Cole Briggs anywhere in the room, and something about his absence unsettled her more than his presence would have. A territorial marshal, she would learn before the day was through, had already ridden out to the hotel that same morning with questions about a man matching his description, and Briggs had not waited around to answer them. Wendell Corrigan sat 2 rows behind Reeve. Josephine caught his eye once early before the proceedings began, and watched something flicker across his face that might have been fear and might only have been irritation at being made to sit through a tedious county hearing. She couldn't tell which. She was starting to think that was exactly the trouble with a man like Wendell. You could never quite tell which face was the true one, right up until it was far too late to matter. Reeve caught her alone in the corridor before it began, the way she'd half expected him to. Last chance, Josephine. Low. Warm. The old summer still living somewhere in his voice, worn thin now but not entirely gone. One word from your husband and this all disappears. The line bends around your hill. Your father keeps his yard. You go home and forget any of this ever happened. A pause, almost gentle. I never wanted to hurt you. I hope you know that much, at least. Josephine looked at him a long moment, thought of the summer she'd believed every word this man ever said, thought of 9 years her father had spent bent under the weight of a lie, dressed up as bad luck. You tried to buy me once, Dalton, she said, with promises that summer. I was young enough to think they were real. She stepped past him, toward the courtroom door. I've grown up a great deal since, and the one thing about me you never understood, the thing that's cost you now, I was never for sale. Not then, not now. It's the single thing about me you couldn't carry east in a cash box. She went in, took her seat beside Garrett, did not look back at him again. The company lawyer laid out the route first. Smooth, quick, called the cheap grade the public good, the onward march of the territory, the plain arithmetic of progress. The small outfits sound like little more than weeds standing in the path of an honest plow. Then, one by one, the valley told the truth back at him. Mrs. Halloway described how the line would cut her 40 head clean off from the only market road she had, her voice steady even as her hands twisted the fringe of her shawl. Lars Jorgensen, careful with his English but not with his conviction, described how the grade would fence his water off behind an embankment no cow alive could cross, and finished by saying plain that his father had not crossed an ocean to lose a well to a company that had never once set foot on the land it meant to take. Man after man, plain word after plain word, they built the thing the company lawyer had spent the last 20 minutes trying to bury, that the cheap grade was cheap because someone else was always the one paying for it. The commissioner listened, made his notes, looked less agreeable by the hour, though Josephine noticed, with a cold, careful unease, that he still would not quite meet Garrett's eye whenever the hill itself came up in testimony. Then it was her turn. She stood, felt 40 families' worth of attention settle onto her at once, and did not let it shake her voice. There's one more thing before you, sir. That isn't marked anywhere on the company's map, though it ought to be. A breath. The route as filed runs directly over a family burial ground. The room went still. On the hill behind our own barn, Josephine said, there are 2 graves, my husband's brother and his wife. My husband cut their marker himself, by hand, over the course of a month of evenings, because he could not bear to set a store-bought board over his own brother's grave. Her voice stayed level. The room leaned in to hear it anyway. The route Mr. Reeve filed runs 4 feet from that marker, close enough that grading it means digging up the dead and moving them to whatever ground the county finds convenient. I've stood on that hill more mornings than I can count now. I've cleaned 2 years of dust out of those letters with the hem of my own apron. There is not a family in this room who would allow a railroad to move their dead for the sake of 1 mile of track, and there is no law in this territory that says they have to. Is the ground recorded? The commissioner asked. It is, Garrett said, standing beside her. My brother filed it as a family plot with this very office before the fever ever came through, long before any company dreamed of a line through this valley. The record turned to our own files. Turned toward Reeve. Is that so, Mr. Reeve? You were aware the ground was recorded? For the first time since Josephine had walked into that room, Reeve's easy composure showed the smallest crack. "This is a family grievance," he said, dressed up as testimony. "It bears no weight on the survey itself." "It bears every weight," the commissioner said, "on whether I can trust a single figure your office has filed with me." He set the maps aside. "The route as filed crosses recorded burial ground. It is denied outright. Your company may refile around it whenever it cares to spend the money, though by my own reading of this grade, I doubt very much it ever will." A murmur went through the room. Not quite triumph yet, but close enough to taste it. Reeve rose smooth, unbothered on the surface, though Josephine could see now exactly how much effort that stillness was costing him. "If the hearing has concluded its business regarding the route," he said, "I'll trouble the commissioner for no more of his morning." "Sit down, Mr. Reeve," the commissioner said. "We are not finished." Silas Whitlock stood next, the strong box of old papers in his shaking hands, and told the room, plain and unhurried, the story of a freight line partnership gone bad 9 years back. Told them about a cash box that left this valley the same week its junior partner did. Told them about a debt that had crushed him for nearly a decade, and a discharge, signed and witnessed, that proved the debt had never rightly been his to carry alone in the first place. "This is the same man," Silas, one shaking finger pointed square at Dalton Reeve across the room, "who came back into this valley wearing a railroad's coat instead of a partnership's, and quietly bought up the very paper he himself created, so he could hold it over my daughter's family the same way he once held it over mine." The room had gone past murmuring now, gone somewhere closer to a held breath. "There's one further matter," the commissioner said, when Silas had finished, "that this hearing has been made aware of, separate from the railroad's business, though I confess I was not certain until this morning whether it belonged in this room at all." He nodded toward the back, and Josephine turned to see Doc Fenwick rise from his seat, a folder in his own hands now, and beside him, hat twisted nervous between his fingers, the young hand from the Hendricks place who'd once tended Ironwood's well. "Say what you told me," Doc Fenwick said gently. "Same as you told me in my front room." The hand cleared his throat, looked for one long moment at Wendell Corrigan sitting frozen 2 rows back. "Saw him out at the well more'n once," the young man said. "Summer before Mr. Thomas and his wife passed. Said he was checking the pump. Didn't think nothing of it. He's family. Why would I?" The room turned as one toward Wendell. He had gone the color of old ash. "This is absurd," he said, standing too fast, his voice cracking on the second word in a way that undid every ounce of composure he'd carried into that room. A stray comment from a hired hand who barely, "There's a purchase record, too," the commissioner said, quiet, and something in that quiet was worse than shouting would have been. "White arsenic, bought 2 years back under the name W. Corrigan, matched by a county chemist's own hand against residue found in a canteen recovered from the same burial ground this hearing has spent its morning discussing." He looked at Wendell over the rim of his spectacles. "I am a land commissioner, sir, not a criminal court. But I will not sit in this room and pretend I have not just heard the shape of a far graver matter than any railroad grade. This hearing is adjourned pending notice to the circuit judge and the territorial marshal." It happened almost gently in the end. No shot fired, no fist thrown. A gray, tired commissioner squared his papers and set them aside, and a valley got its living and its dead back in the same quiet morning. Wendell did not run. Josephine watched him sit back down, instead slow, all the fight gone out of him at once, his face gone slack with the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent 2 years carrying a secret heavier than he ever imagined it would be, and has just, finally, set it down. "I never meant for Thomas," he said, to no one in particular, to the whole room, and to none of it. "I meant it for the water, for the grazing rights. That summer, nothing more. I never thought either of them would drink from that well themselves. I only wanted the north section. I only ever wanted what should have been mine to start with." It was, Josephine thought, watching him, the saddest kind of confession there was. Not remorse for what he'd done. Only grief that the doing of it had cost him more than he'd ever intended to spend. 2 deputies came for him before the room had even finished emptying. Reeve went not long after, the company lawyer already 3 steps toward the door and putting as much distance as decorum allowed between himself and a man now facing charges that no amount of fine gray coats was going to talk away. The territorial marshal caught up with Cole Briggs 8 days later at a rail depot 2 counties east, trying to buy passage under a name that wasn't his own. He was returned to stand for the shooting of Ezra Doyle and for whatever else the marshal's office cared to add to the charge once they'd finished asking their questions. Sheriff Purnell did not last out the season. The circuit judge's own inquiry turned up more than one payment that traced back, plain as day, to a company account bearing Dalton Reeves' signature, and by the time the snow came, the county had a new sheriff, a quiet, unremarkable man. Nobody yet had caused distrust, which Josephine privately considered the finest thing anybody could say about a lawman just starting out. Outside, in the hard, bright autumn light, the valley did a thing Redstone Crossing would talk about for years after. As Josephine came down the land office steps on her husband's arm, the ranchers took off their hats. Not for Garrett, for her. 40 men who had once whispered debt and bargain at a schoolhouse door stood bareheaded in the road as she passed. Mrs. Halloway caught her hand and held it a long moment, said nothing at all, and didn't need to. Lars Jorgensen said ma'am in a voice thick, with something he hadn't the English to properly name, and it went on down the line that way, hat after hat. The whole valley finally standing up to see plainly at last the woman it had spent months looking past. Her father found her by the wagons. He did not twist his hat this time, stood straight instead, an old man who had gotten some piece of himself back that he'd thought was gone for good. You cleared my name in there, he said. 9 years I carried that weight, Josephine. And you set it down in a single morning with a box of old paper I was too ashamed to ever open myself. You carried the paper all those years, Papa. I only opened the box. She kissed his weathered cheek. That's all clearing a name ever really is, someone willing, finally, to open it. He turned quickly away to see to a harness that didn't need seeing to. Josephine let him. A man's dignity is a thing you leave him, even especially when you've just handed the whole of it back. Garrett drove them home the long way, up through the pass, the two of them alone in the wagon, while the aspens burned gold and bare on the high shoulders of the valley below. Somewhere past the halfway point, he drew the horse up in the middle of the empty road and turned to her and said the thing plain, the way he said all the truest things. I asked you to marry me for a fair trade, he said. A debt forgiven for a name. Matchmakers off my porch for a wife in my kitchen. I want to take that back. Josephine's heart went very still. Take back the trade. I want to take back the trade and ask you the other thing instead. He was not a careful man in this moment. Not careful at all. I've gone and fallen in love with my own wife, Josephine Corrigan, which is a fool's thing to have done, marrying first and falling second. I've gone and done it anyway. He swallowed hard. I'll not have this be a bargain between us any longer. I want it to be the real thing, or I want you to tell me plainly that it can't be, and I'll learn to live with that too. Josephine looked at the man who had once offered her a fair trade, and no pity, and had given her, in the month since, a home, a valley, a father's name cleared, and now his whole plain heart held out in the middle of an empty road, like something he wasn't entirely sure she'd take. You great fool, she said, and her voice wasn't steady at all. I chose this valley over my own father's roof, for you. What did you imagine that was, if not the real thing already? She took his face in both her hands. Right there in the middle of the road, the aspens burning gold on the hills around them, and kissed her husband properly for the first time. It was not convenient in the least. Neither of them minded that at all. The railroad never did come up the valley. The company filed once more, months later, around the North Wells, found the grade too costly to justify, and let the whole notion die the quiet death of things that only ever made sense on paper to begin with. Dalton Reeve answered to the circuit judge for a cash box 9 years cold, and for a conspiracy considerably fresher, and left the territory owing a great deal more than he had ever managed to steal, which the valley agreed. Over the following winter was a fitting enough kind of arithmetic. Cole Briggs stood trial alongside him for the shooting, and Ezra Doyle, his shoulder healed enough by spring to sit a horse again, rode the 40 miles to the county seat himself to testify, and came home afterward, he told anyone who'd listen, feeling considerably lighter for having said his piece. Wendell Corrigan stood trial in the spring. Josephine did not attend. Some doors, once closed, are better left that way. Silas Whitlock kept his freight yard, held his head up in Redstone Crossing again, properly, for the first time in nearly a decade. Came to Sunday supper at Ironwood most weeks after, and in his last good years grew back into something close to the straight, steady man he'd been before he ever trusted the wrong partner with a cash box. Ironwood prospered as it always had, but it was a different house now. Louder, warmer. A house where a woman's cooking drew half the valley to the door, and a man who'd once been too careful to presume anything at all had learned, finally, not to be. Josephine never went back to being a person a room could look past. She had fed too many of them by then. stood up for too many of them, been seen too plainly, in a land office doorway, chin level, the truth sitting steady in her mouth. The valley knew her now. It would not forget her again. She and Garrett climbed the hill together most Sundays after that, the two of them, and Silas too, when his knees allowed the walk. That first spring, Garrett cut the marker over again, not to replace the words he'd carved in grief 2 years before, because he would not have parted with that board for anything in the world, only to add beneath it, in letters he took a full month of evenings over, the way he did every single thing that counted, kept safe by the truth, and by the family that stayed. Josephine cleaned the dust from all of it, old letters and new, every Sunday, with the hem of her apron. Set fresh yarrow at the foot of the marker, the way she had the very first week she'd ever climbed that hill alone, not yet knowing what she was about to become to this valley, or what this valley was about to become to her. The single dried sprig she'd carried up to a stranger's grave, that first autumn spread wild over the whole hillside, in the years that followed, sown by careful hands that came back to tend it, season after season, without ever once being asked. Come spring it stood thick and gold at the foot of the marker. The dead lay in a field of it now. Not alone anymore, never alone again. Sometime, of an evening, Josephine would climb the hill by herself, the way she had that very first week, before she'd known what she was walking into, before a rusted canteen and a stranger's smile had taught her how much a quiet valley could be hiding underneath its calm. She would stand a while at the marker, listening to the wind move through grass that had known grief and had gone on growing anyway, and she would think of the girl who had once ridden 40 miles carrying 9 words that weren't even hers to carry. That girl had believed, riding in, that she was delivering an apology and nothing more. She had not known she was walking toward a home, had not known a debt could be forgiven and still leaves something behind, worth keeping, not the $1,100, which had never mattered much in the end, but the plain, unhurried way a careful man had looked at her and not looked away. Connie liked to say, on the rare occasions she allowed herself anything resembling sentiment, that the valley had needed a woman willing to open a box. Nobody else had the courage to open her father's shame, Garrett's grief, a family's buried secret, all of it. Josephine never quite agreed with the way Connie put it. She thought instead that she had simply done what any woman does who has learned, the hard way, exactly how much a person can carry alone, before the carrying breaks something in them. She had refused to let the people she loved carry their heaviest things by themselves. That was the whole of it. That was all it had ever been. The valley remembered her for the hearing, for the truth she'd stood up and spoken plain in a room full of frightened men. But Josephine remembered it differently. Most evenings on that hill, she remembered a kitchen that had smelled of bread and camphor and possibility on a gray afternoon when she'd expected nothing from the world, and the world, against every expectation she'd carried in with her, had given her a home anyway. She was not the woman who had climbed down from that stage 9 years, no, 2 years now and closing on 3 since that October afternoon. She counted it sometimes, the way a person counts a scar healing. Not because the counting mattered, but because it reminded her how far a person could travel without ever once leaving the same 40 miles of valley floor. Garrett found her on the hill most evenings she went up alone, coming to stand beside her without a word, the way he'd learned to do since that very first night on the porch. He never asked what she was thinking. He'd learned, same as she had, that some thoughts needed room to finish themselves before anybody went reaching for them. Good crop of yarrow this year, he said once, come July, looking out over the gold spread of it across the hillside. It remembers being planted with a purpose, Josephine said. I think growing things do sometimes. He didn't argue with that, only took her hand, the way he'd taken it on the church steps the day they married, both of his around it, rough and warm and entirely certain, and the two of them stood a while longer on the hill they'd both nearly lost, watching the light go from gold to gray to the first hard stars, keeping company with the dead and with each other and with the whole plain sturdy, unglamorous truth of a life neither one of them had bargained for, and both of them, in the end, would not have traded for any other.